No problem. We are very grateful for your precious time.
Sure
Let
thing.
me introduce yourself.
Yes, please.
Dr. Uğur is a Turkish-born and Dutch national professor at University of Amsterdam and also a senior researcher at Netherlands Institute of Genocide and Violence Peace Studies. He's an expert on genocide studies and Holocaust, and also written about paramilitary violence, the violence exported by nation states in form of proxy wars. Yesterday, 9th December, was celebrated as the International Day for Genocide and the prevention of this crime. So it is an honor for us that Dr. Uğur is with us in the very next day to share his experience and his knowledge about genocide studies. Thank you, Doctor.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I will share my screen so we have the present.
Yes.
Great, perfect. Well, let me get started then. Welcome everybody, and thank you for inviting me. So in the next roughly half an hour, I will say a few things about mass violence. So how does a country, and we know that there's a number of cases of genocide in the 20th century, and how does a country get to the point that level of mass killing of civilians by a government is possible? Right. So genocide is not common. It is a highly unusual and very brutal form of human coexistence or non-coexistence. And there are a number of myths going around the world or misconceptions, and I think it's important to kind of place genocide in a broader context of political violence. So that's what I do with this slide, and then in the next few slides, I will talk a little about a three-level model of looking at genocide. We'll see how can we study this phenomenon. So first and foremost, genocide does not come from a clear blue sky. Nobody wakes up one morning and thinks, why don't we organize a massacre? Or that, it doesn't go like that. What happens is that you have generally a process that I have here, that I laid out, I structured here in four distinct phases. So first and foremost, here, number one here is a crisis. A society has to be in a profound economic, social, political, and cultural crisis before you can get to the point of genocide further down the line. And crises are more common. They're actually fairly normal, actually, for countries to be in a political crisis. For example, think of a country like Greece, for example, in 2009, when there was a big economic crisis, right? Greece was in a crisis. And a crisis generally means that there's very strong disagreement in the politics, that there's polarization between political groups inside the country. There can be left versus right, there can be secular versus religious, there can be anything. And there are kind of lack of solutions, lack of serious policies that are being formulated by the government, because there is paralysis. And so a crisis is actually fairly normal. A crisis doesn't have to be violent, actually. Most crises are not violent. If you can look at, let's say, the impeachment of President Trump, for example, was a political crisis in the US. Right? There was a very strong disagreement. The politicians on either side didn't talk to each other properly. There was no real consensus building. There was no real sense of deliberation, of getting together and trying to find solutions for the country. No, this was a veritable political crisis. Now, where it gets interesting is when a crisis escalates. Because in some cases, like in Greece, 1 or 2 years later, they got out of the crisis after a period of peaceful polarization, but sometimes they don't. And when they don't, we get into phase number two. And in phase number two, that crisis becomes further polarized. The positions of the different political groups becomes more entrenched. And when they become more entrenched, in essence, that's not a nice thing, of course, but it is not necessarily violent yet. right? So there is a lot of talk, there's negative and polarizing discourse among the politicians in the particular country. But this is not necessarily violent yet, let alone genocidal. It's not at all genocidal. And a lot of countries go through that process of peaceful polarization. And I think where the key difference is when a country crosses that peaceful polarization, which can last sometimes weeks, months, or years, when they cross that threshold from peaceful polarization into violent polarization. For example, there can be a political assassination, or politicians on various sides, they use inflammatory rhetoric in not only disagreeing with another political party, but actually encouraging violence to be committed against another political party or against a political group, ethnic, religious, or social group. Now, this is where you get into the real trouble zone, of course, because violence only breeds violence, and that can get only worse because the polarization only gets strengthened. Now, so far also, this doesn't necessarily have to be a civil war or a genocide yet. The problem is when one of these groups seizes power and we go from phase 3 to phase 4, which is when there's not one isolated violent incident, like one riot, for example, or one small massacre in some corner of the country, or one political assassination, but we see mass violence in that we see large-scale organized violence committed against a particular group or between groups. And this is where we get into the zone where genocide or mass violence against civilians is possible. Right? So first and foremost, I see genocide as a form of mass violence, mass deadly violence, mass murder against civilians. And that can be ethnic group, that can be a religious group, that can be also a political or a social group, even a gender group, if you ask me. And that is only possible in this fourth phase. And now, does anybody know what this picture at the bottom is? Any idea what this can depict?
I clearly don't have any idea about it's kind of a net.
It is a net, definitely. You got that right. But why? What do you think this is?
Anyone else from the class?
I'm just sharing my opinion. The nets are connected, so maybe it denotes to the fact that one thing leads to another, and I think violence, just like sir mentioned, that violence breeds violence. So like if you do one thing, if you do one violent action, if you perform one action, it leads to another, and then that leads to another, and the cycle goes on, and the violence never ends. I think this is what it denotes.
Exactly. That's a very good interpretation of this thing on the bottom here is a picture of a fish net. So I live in the Netherlands. I'm a Dutch citizen, and the Netherlands is famous for fishing. So this is a metaphor, right? This is what they call a fish trap, in which there are 4 different rooms in this net. They're all connected, and they put, of course, this fish bait at the bottom, in each of these rooms at the very end. So the fish swims in and swims around in the first chamber. Then he sees bait in the second chamber. He swims there, and then he swims around there. Then he sees it in the third and in the fourth chamber. By the time that he is all the way at the end, right here at the very end, he's eaten all the bait, but he can't swim back anymore because the net is designed in such a way that you can only go one direction. So this is a very good metaphor, actually, for this violent conflict model. It's very, very easy to swim, towards the right, but it's very difficult to swim back. In other words, it's easy to polarize and to move towards violence, but it's very difficult actually to move back and to depolarize, to make sure that you go from a violent politics to a peaceful politics. And that's what I'd like to focus on now. Now, if we focus only at the fourth phase right now, we zoom in on that. I use these famous Russian dolls as a type of metaphor. So they're like a symbol actually for 3 levels of analysis. The macro level, the level of international relations, international politics, global politics, geopolitics, diplomacy. Then there's the second doll, which is the middle level of the national politics, everything concerning the national high-level domestic politics. And then there's the smallest doll, which symbolizes the local level. So what happens in these neighborhoods and villages and cities, and maybe even families, like at a very local sociological level, when there's a genocide going on. Now, let's and this can of course be before, during, and after. So what happens before a genocide, during, and after a genocide? And if we look at that, let's start with the macro level. Now, first and foremost, before genocides, what's relevant is that the international state system is vulnerable, right? States can break apart and they can emerge. And this is an unstable process. When you look at the world map right now, you shouldn't think this is going to be there forever. It's not. I mean, look at the Soviet Union. It was one state, it collapsed, and then it became multiple states. Look at the European Union. It was all different types of states, and now they're gradually building something that resembles a bigger state. So this is a changing process. In all of this international diplomacy and international relations, what we call IR, bipolar international conflicts are the most dangerous when it comes to mass violence, because bipolar relations are zero-sum. They are often based on kind of exclusive identities, and they are also the most prone to potential forms of war. And there are many examples of this. For example, Germany and Russia, Second World War. Greece and Turkey have gone to war a lot. Bipolar conflict. For that matter, India and Pakistan, for example, is a bipolar conflict, right? So you have two parties. And there are a number of other examples that you could give. Now, during a genocide, of course, the first and foremost, if you look at this, when we transition from before to during, at this level, a crisis and a war are really crucial conditions. There are no genocides without wars, and almost all genocides that occur within the context of war. And there's very little that can be done against it. Why? Because state sovereignty is a key issue here. All states are sovereign, and in principle, no state has the right to intervene in another state's internal business, even if that state is exterminating civilians or innocent civilians, including their own citizens, right? So, and this is what you see across all genocides from the 20th to 21st centuries. Every time some government, often some dictatorship, is committing atrocities, mass atrocities, and the international community says something about it, the head of state will invariably say, but this is state sovereignty, this is international, this is an internal affair, this doesn't concern you. So that is these are the crucial conditions really for genocide. Without that broader context, you cannot really have mass murder. And after that, at this level, the UN gets involved. The International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia is a good example. The Rwanda Tribunal is a good example. The ICC, the International Criminal Court. So then afterwards, the international context gets involved with the aftermath of genocide, especially in the legal context. Now, how do we research this? Mostly with political science theories. For example, there's a theory called democratic peace theory, which argues that democracies don't go to war with each other. So the emergence and spread of liberal democracy around the world is actually good for stability, because these countries don't go to war with each other. It's often authoritarian countries that do that, or dictatorships. And at this level, what's important is to study the Ministry of Foreign Affairs documentation, so diplomatic documentation, right? So what do diplomats talk about? How do they discuss genocides when it happens? Now, let me give you two examples of the macro level. So this is a big map that shows you how well contained state sovereignty actually is. Each country has its own color, and no color can intervene in the internal affairs of another color. And this is one of the most structural problems actually for genocides and for humanitarian intervention. And you see that right now, for example, in China, the Uyghurs, they're all they're in detention camps or concentration camps, and the whole world can be enraged because of this, because these people are civilians and they're being persecuted for their religious beliefs. But the Chinese government would say, well, this is an internal affair. You don't have the right to talk about this. You don't have the right to intervene in my internal affairs. And there are two interesting examples here. One is, this is on the left, Franjo Tudjman, he was the president of Croatia. And on the right, we have the president of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, who was in the end indicted for genocide at the Yugoslavia Tribunal. Now here is a meeting with them in 1991. And so this is a kind of diplomatic moment where the two states are agreeing to invade Bosnia which was in between, right? You have Croatia here, you have Serbia here, and Bosnia is in between. And in this meeting, where they just had lunch in this farm somewhere in Croatia, where they agreed actually to invade Bosnia and to divide Bosnia between them and to commit violence against the Bosnian civilians. A very interesting and important moment. Another example is what's going on in Syria, actually. So since 2011, since President Assad here on the left has been massacring his own population, and we have over 500,000 dead, we have 12 million refugees, many of them here in Europe. How is it possible that a regime like that commits so much violence against its civilians, that they continue to exist? That there's no kind of backlash against them or no outrage? And that is because of diplomatic support, right? So he has secured the support of Vladimir Putin, who believes that President Assad is the best guarantor for stability, in quotation marks. And so this is how a genocidal regime often stays afloat. This is how they often manage to continue and to use state sovereignty and backing from an international great power to continue committing this violence. There are other examples. The Rwandan genocide, for example, was supported by the French government. The Armenian genocide, for example, committed by Turkey, was supported by the Turkish government, was supported by Germany. So very often these regimes, they have some form of international backing. But the most interesting level is really the middle level, the Meso level. So what happens at the intra-state level, inside the state and domestic politics? So here too, there are two important things before genocide. Genocide, in essence, is the consequence of extreme power and extreme ideology that get together. So in a nutshell, that's really what it is. So the extreme power is the concentration of power among the political elites, a dictatorship often. And extreme ideology is, these are often ideologies that revolve around utopias, that are anti-liberal, that distinguish between in-groups and out-groups, and they use violence. Once these two things come together, then you are in very troubled waters. So only extreme power is not enough. Only extreme ideology is also not enough. But when they come together, then we have a number of problems. Namely, then there can be a decision-making process, which is often secret, in which elites decide to massacre or to destroy a civilian population. And this, I have a couple of bullet points here that that is some of the issues that are relevant in this decision-making process. The criminology of elites, right? When these elites, when they decide, for example, the Rwandan government in 1994, when they decided let's kill all the Tutsis, what type of discussions were there in that government meeting, right? What did they calculate? How did they organize it? Construct a division of labor, divide tasks between the civil wing of the government and the military wing of the government. So all of these things are, of course, deeply criminal. But this is why we need to look at the criminology of these elites. How do they decide? Why do they decide? And how do they organize genocide? I think this is absolutely key. Now, after most genocides, you have a transition, sometimes some normalization, sometimes you don't. But very often you have impunity. So a lot of perpetrators go free, unfortunately. And we generally research this with operative documents and by extrapolating. So we have to imagine, because these governments, they're criminal. They're sitting in these rooms, making these criminal decisions. They don't publish these decisions, right? Because they know that the world knows that this is a very profoundly criminal process, these massacres and genocides. So we need to imagine what they must have thought, or how. Okay, so yes. So where were we? Transition, impunity. Okay, so if anybody ever asks you, how does this happen, genocide? In a nutshell, you can simply answer, it is a combination of extreme ideology and extreme power. These things come together, then we are in trouble. And maybe I'll say one more thing about these extreme ideologies. I mean, in the 20th, 21st century, so if you look at the last 150 years, basically, more or less, and you look at all the genocides that were committed, then the biggest killers in terms of ideology were the extreme left and the extreme right. So the extreme left, that was Stalinism, communism, and on the extreme right we have extreme nationalism, and we have fascism, National Socialism, such as Nazi Germany. These two have been the biggest killers. And they are, of course, on totally different ideologies. They are on the opposite end of the spectrum. But what they have in common is a hatred of the center, of like a democratic liberal center, of democratic decision-making, first of all, of liberal coexistence, liberal values, such as a free press, freedoms of opinion and expression, freedoms of association, rule of law. They are both militaristic, in that they feel that the army and that the security agencies should be running a country. And they, most importantly, in these ideologies, they don't necessarily reject violence categorically as a form of politics. Both of these extremes, they believe that violence is actually an acceptable form of conducting politics. So if you disagree with someone, you can kill them. That's basically the idea in these ideologies, which of course is profoundly destructive. Now, let's take a look at maybe one map that maybe Farid would be familiar with, because he's lived in Turkey. But I'll right?
Yeah, I live in Kayseri.
Kayseri, there you go, right
It has
here.
been mentioned, yeah.
So this is a partial map of the late Ottoman Empire of Turkey, and these are provinces, right? Ankara, of course, is the capital of Turkey. Then you have other provinces like Sivas, Erzurum, right over here. Now, what this map shows is the percentage of Armenians that was massacred in 1915. So this is a pie chart. In black, you have the percentage of Armenians that were killed, and these gray ones are the percentage of Armenians that were deported. So they haven't been killed yet, but they were deported, and often they died later because of the deportations, which were also very destructive. Now, here you see the brutal consequence, actually, of genocide and of genocidal decision making. In that, look at some provinces have been entirely devoid of Armenians. Armenians have been thoroughly annihilated. In other provinces, such as Kayseri here or Adana, the Armenians were, seriously assaulted. Of course, they've been decimated, but not fully destroyed. Such 14%, for example, or in this case, 28% in Kayseri, and here even more in Adana, of Armenians somewhat made it through the first massacres. And in these provinces also, the survival rates are higher. So, and I think that this is important because it means that genocide, okay, you have these political elites, they decide together in this room in the capital, we're going to kill all the Armenians or the Tutsis or whatever you want to call it. And when they want to implement it, often they can have problems on the ground. So, for example, some local populations that they thought would help them don't. So there can be some resistance. Some of the victim populations resist. There can be a governor, for example, in one of these places that is corrupt and doesn't want to carry out the orders for massacre, or is not corrupt, but it's a very moral person who says that, this massacre is against my religious belief, this is against humanity, and I'm not going to cooperate with this. So, the decision can be taken very centrally, but once it is spread out and once it is, it descends onto the provinces and on the land, then actually such a government in organizing the genocide has to take care that they implement it thoroughly, because otherwise they will run into these type of snags and forms of resistance or inaccuracies, right? And this, of course, ultimately is for the victim group is a good thing because they survive, right? To give one example, in Ankara, for example, Ankara province, a number of Armenians, 29% survived because there was a local mufti, right? We, of course, know what a mufti is. The local mufti in Ankara said that the massacre of Christians is unacceptable and it's wrong according to Islam, and he's not going to cooperate with this. And he wrote a fatwa against the government, saying that we understand that it's a war and we understand that there is some hatred between Turks and Armenians, but to go out and take women and children from their houses and to kill them in the middle of the streets is profoundly against my religious beliefs. And he writes this fatwa and sends it to the government, protecting his Armenian neighbors. And ultimately, the government first threatens him. He still continues with this policy of resisting the genocide. And in the end, the government arrests him and hangs him. So he's executed for his resistance against the genocide. Right? So these type of examples, they exist in every genocide, actually. Good people who resist because they think it is unacceptable. Happens all the time. And then there are a number of documents that these elites write down. So here on the left, we have a document that's signed by Stalin. Maybe some of you read Russian, you can see that here, very on the top, it says Stalin. Stalin signs a document here massacring 25,000 Polish civilians. And here on the right is a list that the Nazis came up with, Nazi Germany, a list of all the Jews that should be killed in every province in every country, right? Totaling up to 11 million. Of course, they never made it to 11 million. They made it to about 6 million. But the cold brutality, the cold calculation of human beings, right? I mean, because these are families, these are old people, these are pregnant women, these are children, these are totally different, diverse populations of very different cultures, Jewish people from very different countries, and all they wanted to do is to exterminate all 11 million of them, right? So you see in these state documents the detached brutality, actually, of genocide, and I've looked at a lot of these type of documents. Now let's get to the final issue. There were 3 dolls, right? The smallest doll is the micro level, and that can be the city, the village, the family, or maybe even the individual. How do human beings behave when there is a genocide going on? How do they behave as perpetrators? How do they behave as bystanders? And how do they behave as victims? And here too, before a genocide, you have to study the interethnic relations. So why and how are there tensions at the local level that can be mobilized by a government, that can be exacerbated and lead to local conflicts in which people end up killing each other? And here too, individual ambitions and grievances are very important. So why do some people get involved as perpetrators and other people don't? And why did that mufti, he rejected the genocide, but some other mufti, for example, cooperated in the genocide, he collaborated in the genocide and became an accomplice. So this is a very important, local details that we can only study if we look at that local level. And then during genocide, well, I talked a bit about regional variation. So different provinces can have different outcomes of the genocide. And also at the individual level, for perpetrators, there are basically 3 processes. There's initiation into the violence. Perpetrators, they enter this violent system and they have to commit violence. It is asked of them. They are ordered to do so. Then number 2, they implement the violence. They carry out violence. And number 3, they have to adapt psychologically as human beings. They have to make sure that they don't get too involved with the victims. They have to make sure that they switch off their compassion and empathy. So they have to distance themselves with the victims. Otherwise, they can't do the bloody job. So these 3 processes are very important with individuals, actually. And afterwards, you can often have a perpetrator trauma. So even the people who did all the killing, actually, they can feel bad about it sometimes. They can have nightmares. They can have trauma. They sometimes repress their memories and their emotions because they're afraid of punishment. They're afraid that somebody will find out what they did, or they're sometimes afraid of the wrath of God in the hereafter. Now, reconciliation, of course, is a very difficult concept. I'm not sure whether I really believe in it, considering all the research I did. But the way that we study this level, or this micro level, is through confessions and leaks and interviews with people and survivor testimony. So talking to survivors of genocide is very important because they have seen things nobody else has seen. Now, let me give you one example of a local micro level. This is the village of Visegrad in Bosnia, eastern Bosnia. And what you see here is really a beautiful landscape. And Bosnia is actually a really beautiful country. It's very green, and it has rivers, and it has a really clean weather, a clean air, and it's really beautiful in general. And here you have the town right on the banks of the river. And there's an old bridge here, which was built in the Ottoman period. so it's an Ottoman construction. And as beautiful as it looks, unfortunately, terrible things happened in this village. In 1994, 1995, people in this village were massacred, and they were thrown off this bridge into the river. Bosnian Muslims. There was a lot of violations against women. People were crammed into houses and burnt alive in certain cases. So really terrible things happened. And the people who did that were their neighbors, right? So how is it that neighbors can kill neighbors? This is really one of the most important questions in genocide studies. How do people who know each other for years, for decades, for generations sometimes, how do they and why do they turn on each other? It's a very difficult question that requires lots of kind of detailed research in this town. So if you want to understand it, you have to go to a town like that and talk to people and try to understand what are the local dynamics and problems that existed before the government ordered the genocide in this town. And then also finally, my final slide, who are all the young men who are doing all the killings, right? So this is a picture of the Republican Guard, the Haras al-Jumhuri in Arabic, who are responsible for a lot of the mass killing against Syrian civilians that I'm sure that you've seen, unfortunately, on the YouTube and in the news. And these young men, who are they? How did they get involved in this, in these elite troops? And why did they commit this violence? How do they feel about it? What type of ties do they have with each other? And how do these ties strengthen through committing the violence? So a lot of things can be asked about the psychology of perpetrators. And I think that is one of the key issues of genocide as well, to try to understand the perpetrators. And I'd like to end with that. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free.
Thank you so much, Dr. Uğur. I think I would begin with a question I have in mind from the beginning, and a question which raised in my mind during the last session. And after that, the students will come with their questions. Firstly, I would like to ask you to clarify more on the bipolar issue you were talking about, that the more violence is resulted from a bipolar conflict between the nations. But as we see in Russia, there are multipolar conflicts we can see in Russia. So how would you explain that one in Russia, in Syria, sorry?
Okay, that's a great question. I think if you look at bipolar conflicts, and I named two, I named Turkey, Greece, historically in the past 100 years, and I named India and Pakistan since 1948. We could have given some other bipolar examples as well. Japan and China, for example, in the Second World War, right? There's a long history of animosity between these two nations. Another example is if you look at, for example, Serbia and Croatia, it's also a very good example. For that matter, Germany and France, Germany and Russia. So they all have, of course, to some extent, this multipolar, but the dynamic of those particular conflicts, they really lead to a particularly kind of potentially very violent and nasty dynamic, especially if you have, say, you have two countries, and there's a sharp bipolar conflict between them. And in these two countries, there is a minority of this country that lives in the other one. And the other way around, there's a minority of this country that lives in that one. So for example, in Turkey and Greece was like that. There was a Greek minority in Turkey, and there was the Turkish Muslim minority in Greece. And then the states go to war with each other. And how does it feel then to be a Turkish minority in Greece or to be a Greek minority in Turkey? You are automatically associated in being a fifth column and in supporting the enemy troops, and being met with suspicion, of course, right? So, and you had that also with, for example, Russia and Germany. There was a German minority in Russia, and there was a Russian minority, or to some extent Jewish minority, who were seen as Russians in Germany. So when the countries go to war, there's also an internal, or often, unfortunately, internal risk of violence against these minorities. So in most cases, Rwanda, Burundi is another very good example. Cambodia, Vietnam, also bipolar conflict. They had conflict with each other quite a bit. So what happened in the end, of course, the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian communists under Pol Pot, they ended up killing every single Vietnamese person in their own country because they accused them of working with the enemy because there are these bipolar conflicts. Now, how exactly that works out, we still need a lot of research on it. But for now, this looks more or less like these are some of the most dangerous dynamics, and more. I mean, closer to your country. I mean, think of, for example, Muslims in India, right? I mean, the way that they are being treated and they are being cast suspicion on them as being agents of Pakistan, for example. I think that is a very dangerous dynamic, right? And unfortunately, you see that all over the political discourse of the BJP, from way back before the Gujarat massacre. This is a typical example, actually, of this type of dynamic in which an inner minority is seen as a fifth column, as potentially seditious and as potentially treasonous.
I think you'd be familiar with Hannah Arendt's opinion in his book, The Trial of Adolf Eichmann. So, how do you think her opinion goes with this explanation of genocide? She argues that, and also presents the evidence that psychological tests conducted by the Israeli government on him were resulted that he was more normal than other normal persons around there. So, is it not a normal phenomena, or only some extremist ideological people are involved in this genocidal crime?
Yeah, very good question, Farid. I think, well, the key question for me is, of course, Hannah Arendt looked only at Adolf Eichmann. But if you take that example and you look at other examples across the world, how can we explain that normal people start believing in extreme ideologies, or they join extreme ideologies, right? So if you look at some of the extreme ideologues, or some of the more deadly political leaders, and you look at how they grew up as children and as young people, and at some point in their youth, they go to study at university. At some point, something changes. They start believing in either conspiracy theories or some really nonsensical, unscientific things, and that can sometimes push them towards radicalization, especially if they find a group willing to facilitate that type of extreme ideology, right? I mean, you look at, for example, Stalin. I mean, Stalin is one of the worst killers in the 20th century. He has been responsible for a large number of mass executions, entire deportations of ethnic groups, including the Tatars, the Chechens, the Koreans, the Greeks, the Armenians, I just name it. Then the mass execution order that I just showed you of the Polish officers, a large number of war crimes during the Second World War. So a man like that, if you read his biography, he's born in Georgia, close to Tbilisi, and he's growing up. He's a young man. He goes to a religious seminary, and then he stops, and then he has an argument with his father. He tries to go study, and so under normal conditions, a person like that would have become maybe a shop owner or a taxi driver, or maybe somebody working at a bank. So unremarkable person. But how is it that a normal person like that, unremarkable, banal person like Stalin, could have ended up running the Soviet Union, in a matter of years? And that is partly because there is a communist party that's getting stronger in that period, in which he joined, and that is partly also because the Russian Empire is crumbling. So as the empire crumbled, the Communist Party seized power, and Stalin was in the party, so he became the head of state. So it's a number of conditions at the highest level down to the lowest level. But if you look at the biographies of some of these perpetrators, they're actually quite unremarkable. You're right about that.
Students and other fellows, if you have any question, you can ask by unmuting your microphones.
Okay, so hello, assalamu alaikum, sir. My name is Abdul Mois, and I have a question that in your opinion, what do you believe? What kind of a political discourse should states opt in order to avoid genocides as much as possible? Like, and please give evidence to your answer if you say liberal democracy or communism, or what kind of a perspective should a state have a political discourse in order to, avoid genocides as much as possible?
Great question, Abdul Muiz. Thank you. Wa alaikum salam. So I think that we need to be scientific about this, right? So what does the broader modern history of the world tell us about, okay, which ideologies and which type of politics leads to violence and which type doesn't? And if we look at that whole thing, as I said, communism as extreme left and fascism as extreme right, these two things, they don't really work. Why? Because if you look at the history of communism and fascism, they've been extremely destructive and very genocidal. Fascism from, of course, Mussolini down to, of course, Hitler, but also other forms of fascism, such as, think of Latin America, right? So like in Argentina and in Chile, you had Videla. In Chile, you had President, it was General Pinochet. So Pinochet, he seized power undemocratically. And he then started basically set up a fascist regime, and he killed about 40,000, 50,000 people without any due process or whatsoever, just because they were his political opponents. So anybody who now, if I would meet somebody in the street tomorrow who would tell me, Dr. Uğur, fascism is a great system, I would tell him no, because the history of fascism shows us that it's not really good for coexistence and coherence of a society. So that doesn't work. So what does work? I mean, I think three things: an inclusive political discourse. So a political discourse in which you don't exclude or what they call otherize certain groups, right? So to have a political discourse with seeing the person across you to disagree with, but not as an enemy, right? It's just a human being has different ideas. Which is fine. It's okay to have different ideas. I mean, Allah created us to have different ideas. That's normal. The second important thing is to have a consensus democracy. So a way in which we say, okay, we have a vote, and in this vote, the majority basically decides who becomes the head of state or what policies are being run. But it doesn't mean that we marginalize or exclude the minority completely. We also take some of their ideas on board, right? Take, for example, very good example now, Joe Biden becomes the next US president. He doesn't say, aha, I'm the Democratic Party, I got all the votes, and we're going to exclude every single Republican. No, he says, actually, I also want to take a Republican governor or a Republican politician and put them in my cabinet if they're really committed and good at their job, right? So that's a consensus building democracy without marginalizing that group. And so that's three things. So no hate speech in a type of consensus building democracy. And a third thing that I think is also very important is to have checks and balances built into a democratic system in which the system can have oversight of itself, right? So for example, if I'm a minister and I get a budget from the state and I have to build bridges and I have to build roads, yeah? Let's say I'm the Minister of Transport, then how do they know that I'm spending that money on the bridges and on the roads and not filling my own pocket or distributing the money to my family members, which is what happens in a number of countries, as you know, unfortunately also in the countries where we are from. And that counts for corruption, to have oversight of corruption, but there can also be oversight of violence. For example, how do we know that a general whose only job is to keep the armed forces professional, keep them running properly, how do we know that general is not trying to plot a coup d'etat? Right? So there have to be internal checks and balances also in the security forces of a country. I think that's also very important, that everybody knows their job and nobody starts having ideas of overturning democracy. Because that's what happens when you get a military coup d'etat or a military dictatorship. And the history of Turkey is a very good example of that. I mean, of course, Pakistan also has experiences with that, a number of other countries as well. And that is because of the lack of oversight, the lack of accountability. These three things I think are important.
Sir, thank you so much for the answer. I just have one more question. I'm sorry if I'm taking some time. The second question is that what do you believe that the international parties like the United Nations or the UNSC or the International Court of Justice are effective in terms of dealing with interstate conflicts? What is your opinion on that?
Wow, that's a great question, and it's by coincidence, of course. I live in Amsterdam, which is not very far from The Hague. So in The Hague, we of course have a number of these institutions: the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the Yugoslavia Tribunal was there, and there are a number of other, like the Lebanon Tribunal, for example, was there, and there are a number of other international agencies and institutions. And first of all, these organizations, take the ICC, they can only exist, they stand and they fall, or they fall, with the investment and the serious commitment of the parties to the ICC, right? So all of us, let's say roughly there are 196 countries, or almost 200 countries in the world. If half of us say we're not interested in ICC, we're not going to contribute, then obviously it will fail. But if we all go on board and we invest in this, which means we also give up a little bit of our own sovereignty, and we say, well, if my army commits crimes, yeah, they will go to the ICC and they'll be judged there. But your army too. So all of us are in the same boat. If that sense of collective responsibility is not there, then it will become, of course, very difficult to have these institutions running. And the problem with the ICC now is that some of the most powerful countries in the world haven't ratified the ICC, and they're not on board. They don't want to be part of it, including the United States, including Russia, including China. They're thinking, why should we give up some of our sovereignty to the ICC? And as a result of that, only relatively weaker countries, of course, they are part of it, which means that if there are crimes committed in Kenya, for example, or in Central African Republic, yes, or in Myanmar, for example, then yeah, they go to the ICC or they go to the ICJ. But they should also count as a rule of law, an international rule of law. It should also count, of course, for the more powerful countries. So the power imbalances in the world, they're really a problem for this, you know. The final thing about this, the international institutions like the let's say there's a massacre going on somewhere in the world. And everybody says, we have to intervene, we have to do something. As humanity, we have to do something. But what happens, of course, is that people look at the United Nations, and the United Nations says, okay, we have a Security Council, and there are permanent 5 members in the Security Council, of whom 4 of them vote for intervention in that country to stop the massacre, but 1 of them has a veto. Because of the permanent 5 members, they have veto rights. So what happens then? Nothing. The massacre goes on, right? And in these permanent 5, you get a little bit of this type of jealousy and geopolitics, in that if, let's say, if the United States wants to intervene in a massacre and stop it, then China, for example, or Russia will say, no, we're against it only because you're for it. Not because it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. No, we're against it only because we're against it only because you're for it. And the other way around. If Russia wants to intervene somewhere, for example, then the US will say, no, we don't want that, because if you're for it, we're against it. So they're kind of blocking each other out in a very childish way. And that's because of the system is broken. The permanent 5 have a veto right, and they shouldn't.
Thank you so much for answering questions.
I had a question. It was regarding the Armenian genocide that you mentioned earlier. It was carried out on such a large scale, then why is it that US only recognized it recently?
A very good question. Thank you very much. Well, the broader question here is, why are some genocides recognized very late and others are recognized very quickly? And there are different reasons for that. I think one of it, of course, is the fact that the Armenian community in 1915 was roughly 2 million people across the world, and about 1.4, 1.5 million of them were killed in the genocide. This is one of the biggest massacres in the entire history of the Middle East. This is much worse than anything that happened to the Palestinians or to the Kurds or to the Iraqis or whatever, but only has been recognized fairly late. Now, why is that? And I think it's partly because, there are several reasons, partly because the Armenian community was so weakened because of the genocide that they found it very difficult to explain what happened to themselves to the world. If you read what Armenian writers tried to write in the 1920s and 30s, they're absolutely shocked. They have no clue what happened to them, right? They're dumbstruck. So they also can't explain themselves to others to have them recognize it. And that counts, for example, for the Armenian community in the United States, who, of course, try to lobby their own government because they're all US citizens. They try to lobby their own government, please recognize our genocide. But because it took them 2 to 3 generations only to overcome that trauma and to actually formulate a coherent demand from the US government, it took that long. Whereas other groups, for example, it's much easier with, such as the genocide of Tutsis in Rwanda, was recognized much earlier because, well, we had modern media, of course, and we have a more globalized world. And of course, the Tutsis, after the genocide, they seized power in that state, which means they had the state apparatus in their hand. The president, Paul Kagame, for example, is Tutsi background. So they could set it as government policy towards the world. They could go to the United Nations and talk for 2 hours and explain what the genocide was. So that's definitely part of it. Of course, on the other hand, there's also strategic, geopolitical, selfish reasons for certain states to recognize some genocides, but not others, right? So for example, Turkey and Iran are always very good examples. I mean, Iran is a country that borders both Pakistan and Turkey, so that's a good example. So Turkey, for example, recognizes the Holocaust, but denies the Armenian genocide. Iran does the exact opposite. They recognize the Armenian genocide, but they deny the Holocaust. And why is that? Because they have geopolitical ties with this country or with that country. Iran has good ties with Armenia, right? So they recognize the genocide. Iran has bad ties with Israel, so they deny the Holocaust just to irritate the Israelis, which by the way, I think is a bad idea, but that's just, it's my personal opinion. And Turkey does the exact opposite. Turkey dislikes Armenia, so they deny their genocide. Turkey has good military and diplomatic relations, regardless of what President Erdogan says. Good military and diplomatic relations with Israel, so they acknowledge the Holocaust. This is basically the selfishness in it, and the hypocrisy. Okay, go ahead, Dua, and then after that we go to Feraz.
Okay, I was just asking, what about the colonial genocides, like the one conducted by Netherlands and Indonesia? Why are they not acknowledged as much as other genocides?
Great question again. A number of colonial genocides have not been acknowledged so far for various reasons. The Netherlands is a very good example, and you have a genocide late 19th century and then in 1946 to 1949, where the Netherlands tried to hold on to their Indonesian possessions. And there are a range of atrocious massacres being committed by the Dutch then. And the reason why they haven't been acknowledged is because the Netherlands itself has not had that transformation in which they became introspective and looked at the violence in their own history. For example, the Germans have done this. If you talk to Germans, there are no Germans who, like serious Germans who deny the Holocaust, because there are a number of nutcases, of course, and like neo-Nazis, but overall, as a society, they've recognized it. The Netherlands hasn't, for various reasons. I think the education system, the genocide in Indonesia wasn't taught. I grew up, for example, in high school. They never taught us that. I had to learn about it by myself in university. And there was a large lobby of veterans. So the veterans of that war, of course, were an important political force in the country, who lobbied the government saying, if you recognize this as genocide, and if you side with the Indonesians on this issue, then we'll have a serious problem with this. Then we'll disrupt your policies. So, and this was the case in many countries, by the way, in Belgium as well. Belgian colonial genocide in Congo, French colonial genocide in Vietnam, for example, or especially in Algeria. So there are a number of colonial powers who've not looked inward enough. Britain is relatively okay on this issue, but can also still do much more. And this is part of the problems of colonialism, is that because the genocide was committed very far away against an ethnic group or against a nation that was not really respected, as is not in colonialism, it's also very difficult for these countries to look inward. But this is changing now, by the way. There's a big research project now in my institute in the Netherlands that's publishing the results in a few months that will most likely make that case, and that will create a storm in this country. So keep your eye on the news.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Faraz, you can ask your question.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. I just wanted some clarification regarding your lecture. We see in the context of genocide, as you have mentioned, liberalism has clearly performed better states, but in the context of violence and war crimes, don't you think that the liberal states have equally performed horrific actions like in Iraq, Afghanistan, or in the previous British colonial age? We see same horrific crimes performed by these liberal states as well. So, in the context of violence, don't you are equally dangerous or have committed crime at the equal level? Like some clarification regarding this.
Very good, thank you. Walaikum salam. And I think there's a good point to be made that there's a certain hypocrisy in the kind of liberal democratic colonial powers, in that they preach liberal democracy in their own countries, and yet they go out and they occupy and burn and destroy in the colonies. And that is definitely the case. On the other hand, had these countries been serious about liberal democracy and also implemented, for example, liberal democratic policies in the colonies, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, then we would not have seen that, of course. So colonialism is not compatible with liberal democracy. One cannot be democratic to believe in consensus, etc., and exclude colonial subjects from it. Right? That's not real kind of that's not an ideal of liberal democracy. And the same thing for the U.S., which is internally liberal democratic, but externally it runs a policy of an empire.
Until someone else is speaking, I also wanted a clarification on the progression of genocide you told a while ago, about the progression going on in India. Do you see that, according to the analogy of the fish net you gave a while ago, is India prone towards or going towards genocide, or is it possible for a comeback in coming few years? Because as you are seeing legislations going on, like recent Love Jihad legislation or the legislation of Citizenship Amendment Act last year, what do you think about the progression going on in India?
Good question, Farid. A few things about the previous question, still about the US, and then I'll move to this one. So the US empire, right? So how is it that a country that's internally fairly democratic goes out and exports violence and commits atrocities left and right? I mean, this, of course, I think this is partly for reasons that the most often, and in most countries this is the case, the army, and especially the external activities of the army, are not under the same scrutiny, kind of democratic oversight and scrutiny as any other policy is, such as the economy or the education system or the healthcare system, or you name it. So that is one of the reasons why, because there's less oversight, there's also less pressure to conform with human rights norms. This is the case in the US. We saw the recent Australian massacre of Afghan civilians. You know, the same thing. Australia, if you live as an Australian citizen, you know, it is a fairly democratic country. You can get things done there, you know. It's fairly representative. On the transparency and democracy rankings every year, they come out fairly high. But because the army and the special forces units that are out there in Afghanistan are not under the same scrutiny as for example, the police force in Melbourne or Canberra is, right? Because that concerns Australian citizens. So because this doesn't concern Australian citizens, or in the US case, it doesn't concern US citizens, but Afghan citizens or Iraqis, there's not that much oversight on it. And so that can lead to excesses of violence, for example, that can occur. Not to mention, of course, that, for example, the US invasion of Iraq was not a democratic process because they didn't get the approval of Congress for that. But let's not forget that either. Now, the question you asked, Farid, I think this is maybe one of the more difficult questions, because nobody knows the future, right? I mean, that is very clear. Nobody knows the future. We can't predict the things. And there have been a number of political scientists, they have tried to predict genocide, and they've almost all failed. Because they can be unpredictable sometimes. Yes, there's a model of the fish net, And yes, a lot of countries can go from crisis to peaceful polarization to violent polarization to mass violence, civil war, mass violence, genocide. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So, and you have unlikely cases also where there's violence against civilians going on, such as in India, for example, which is often called, well, okay, the largest democracy in the world. There's hundreds of millions of people voting, and there's fairly stable coexistence of different ethnic religious groups in that country. I've traveled through India a couple of times, and if you look at the political culture, though, there's a major shift with the ascendance and the increased power of Narendra Modi and the BJP, right? So this is a typical example when there's one extreme party, and I see the BJP as an extreme party. They have extreme ideology because they believe in Hindutva, and extreme power they don't really have yet because, well, it's still a democracy. You still have Congress party to worry about. You still have other like societal, institutional actors to worry about. So they don't have extreme power yet. But if they do, if you look at the recent legislation, for example, exclude the Citizenship Act, or if you look at Hindu vigilantes, for example, going out killing people because they're accused of being cattle traders or killing cows, for example, and in the way that those vigilantes get away with murder, literally, then of course we are on dangerous ground. And we are especially on dangerous ground because the head of state, Modi, already had a massacre in his back pocket from Gujarat. If you look at the dynamics of the Gujarat massacre, you see that he doesn't go and organize it, but he knows it's happening and he doesn't stop it. So it's not a crime of commission, it's a crime of omission. And if that same political culture he's now having as chief minister, as prime minister, then of course we are, and I wouldn't want to be an Indian Muslim right now, or for that matter, an Indian Sikh or an Indian Christian or an Indian whatever, So the discourse, the power, the policies that Modi is carrying out now, not only not in Gujarat, but on the national level, that's what scares me and what I find very disconcerting, to be honest. It is not unthinkable that, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, so maybe in your lifetime, he might organize not only to exclude all Indian Muslims from citizenship, but maybe also to try to expel them from the country. And he might say, for example, okay, you are Muslims, why don't you move to Pakistan? So you get like refugees coming into Pakistan. So that's possible. Or worse, the Chinese detention camps. We don't really see a serious backlash in the world. What if Modi thinks I'm going to do the same? Right. So, and that is a really dangerous and very destructive force for Indian society, in which really Hindus and Muslims, they get along overall fairly well in that society. You don't have daily riots or daily violence between groups because they're culturally very close to each other. Right. There might be different religions, but overall they eat the same thing, they speak the same language, and live in the same cities. They do all the same commerce, the same trade. They go to the same schools. But that's not how the BJP sees it.
Thank you so much for the precious time. It was an informative session, and everybody in the class would also like to thank you for the precious time and the knowledge you provide. And we would be in touch with you for more coordination and more research projects if someone is interested in genocide studies. Thank you so much.
Thing. Thank you for listening. And this was my first ever lecture for a Pakistani a group of Pakistani students. So it was also very nice for me. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the class. And hope to see you soon.
Tashakkur.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Alaikum salam.
Thank you, sir.